Welcome back. So in the last video, we saw how column charts can be used to visualize comparisons between data points. But they're also highly effective at visualizing how numbers change over time. Say, for example, we wanted to compare sales of our different product categories over time, as we see here. With pivot charts, it's surprisingly easy. So let's get started. First up, in our starter file, let's go ahead and create a pivot chart with year and month on rows and our number of line items sold measure on values. So I'll go to Insert, Pivot Chart, and then I'll just create a pivot chart, not a pivot chart and a pivot table. And then for our measure, I'll go to our Order Details table and drag in our number of line items measure. And then for my category axis, I'll go up to our calendar table and drag in year and then month. Now this breakout is fine as it is, but to me, the inclusion of months has made our chart just a little bit too granular. Unless we want to make our chart really, really wide, like as wide as our entire screen, we just don't have the screen real estate to see all of the months for all of the years over the entire time frame we've been selling products. So quarter might actually be a more appropriate breakout under year. So let's try that instead. So let's remove month and then drag in quarter. And already that just looks a lot cleaner and easier to interpret. And because we're dealing with a slightly less granular breakout of our time frame, now we're able to see all the individual quarters above their respective years. So now we've introduced the element of change over time into our visualization. But what if we want to compare how our value changes over time among different categories? So right now we're just looking at how our number of line items sold measure overall changes from one year, from one quarter to the next. But what if we wanted to see a breakout along, say, product category? How can we show a comparison between the numbers for each of these categories while also retaining this quarter over quarter, year over year trending we have right now? Well, it turns out that's what this legend section of our field list is for, if we need to see our measure broken out by multiple different categories. So let's add product category to that section. And now for the first time, this little section over to the right of our chart is starting to make sense. Whereas before, when it simply said total, it clearly wasn't adding much value. Now it's providing us this useful color-coded breakout of the three categories that we're plotting for every quarter in our chart. So instead of it just being useless chart junk that we would delete to free up more space in our chart, it's something that's not only useful, but quite essential to interpreting the dense information that we've managed to cram into this one chart. Now, if we want to supercharge our chart even further and give our users even more ability to slice and dice the data being visualized in different ways, we can again add a slicer. So to create some room, I'll get rid of our field list here and then drag our chart over to the left. And now, with the chart still selected, I'll choose Insert Slicer, and then click the All tab, and then find our Regions table, and insert a slicer for that. And now since we have quite a few regions, I'll change the orientation of our slicer to have 3 columns instead of 1. And then I'll widen it out just a bit, and just a bit more, and then shorten it up a little bit. Then I'll change the caption to read region. And now I'll drag this over just a bit to kind of align it with our chart. And now that we have our slicer, we can use it to interact with our chart and see what our trending looks like for just one particular region at a time. Or if we configure our slicer to allow us to select multiple values, we can see how our numbers look for multiple regions at one time. Now, before we go, I want to introduce you to a different variation of a column chart that's particularly useful for visualizing how the different categories in our chart add up as percentages of a whole. So let's make sure our chart is selected, and then hit the Design Contextual tab, and then change our chart type. And now, with the column chart category still selected, we're going to select the second option from the left, called a stacked column chart. And now if we click OK, you see that instead of a different column for each of our categories, all of our categories are condensed into a single column. And within that column, we see the relative proportion of each category. So in this way, it's more effective than a traditional column chart in conveying how much each of our categories contributed to our measure for a given quarter. Okay, so up next, we're going to walk through yet another type of chart, this one even more effective at visualizing changes in our data over time. I'll see you then.